All right. I think it's 12:01, so let's give it like another minute and then we'll start. Okay. All right. Thank you everyone for joining the webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Today we have a very, very exciting topic to discuss. We are discussing redefining ALS clinical endpoints by using the potential of digital health technologies. And we have a great panel with us today. I'm just going to go to the next slide if I can. Yes. Sorry. It's been okay. So the agenda for today's webinar is we'll just start with the introduction and then Nadia will present on why DHTs matter to ALS patients and caregivers, some patient perspective on DHTs. I will briefly talk about the ALS workshop we did at the ADDS 2025 and what are the key takeaways and findings from this. Then we have two presentations from industry partners, Modality AI and ZephyRx on self-guided ALS assessments and remote respiratory monitoring. And then we'll have Colin join on the panel discussion and we'll discuss few points related to this topic and also we'll answer the questions from the audience. So I would just like to have our panelists briefly introduce ourselves. We'll go in the order of the pictures that we have on the screen. So Nadia, could you please start?
Hi, everyone. My name is Nadia Sethi. I'm a dentist by training. My husband passed away in 2020 from a fast progressing form of genetic ALS. I have been involved with many ALS organizations since his diagnosis. I've built two tools to help people find information on clinical trials, and I'm currently in process for launching an organization called North Star ALS. Part of what I do is a lot of social media engagement that's focused on the science of ALS. I have a community of 9,000 people where we talk clinical trials and research, and that's all we do. So I'm hoping to build on that platform, and I'm very passionate about DHTs for ALS, so very glad to be here today.
Thank you, Nadia. Adam?
Hi, everyone. Adam Laprade, based in Manhattan. My background educationally is biomedical engineering, where I really focused on translational solutions for respiratory diseases. So I'm here with Zephyr-X today, and I'll talk to you about our product and how it fits into ALS, and really how we're trying to bring pulmonary function testing into the homes of patients together with Ametris. So pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Adam. DSO?
Hey, I'm DSO, founder and CEO of Modality. We create self-guided clinical, or in this case, ALS assessments. You will learn a little bit more about what that really means. My background is in artificial intelligence. I've been in AI for 25 years, leading on companies, leading R&D divisions in industry. As a professor of computer science, published over 200 papers and patents. Today, we'll speak a little bit about science, but also about how these DHTs can really help identify disease progression in collaboration also with ActiGraph and Ametris now.
Thank you, DSO. Colin?
I'm Colin Hogengay. I'm the Vice President for Rare Orphan and Pediatric Diseases at Critical Path. And relevant to this conversation, I lead the ACT4ALS initiatives as part of the PPPs. And one of the working groups that we have is around DHTs and an application to ALS. As a whole, CPATH works in the non-competitive space to build really working groups aimed at advancing drug development solutions. And so we work and engage with regulators, sponsors, persons with lived experience, nonprofits, scientists, all aimed at trying to create regulatory endorsed solutions and then frameworks for how they can be applied to advance therapeutic development. My background, I'm a clinical pharmacologist and a genetic epidemiologist, and hold a couple SGA appointments with the FDA and advisory role with Imprima, and I'm the rare disease research advisor for PCORI. So.
Thank you, Colin. And I'm Rakesh Pilkar, lead of DHT Solutions at Neuroscience at Ametris, and I'll be moderating this panel today. So let's get started. Still going through. All right, so now let's get into the presentation. Nadia, this is all yours now.
Thank you so much, Rakesh. If you can advance the slide to the next one. Wonderful, thank you. All right, so let's see. ALS has very strong unmet needs. It's a very dire, awful disease. In the last several years, our science pipeline has gotten much stronger, but we're still needing outcome measures that are better. We may be seeing some of our trial failures that have happened in more recent years because our measures are not objective, sensitive, or continuous. Families who are living with this disease face a very high disease burden. It's very hard to travel to research sites or even to care appointments. I remember it would cost us hundreds of dollars as the disease advanced to get a wheelchair accessible van, and we would literally come home and sleep for the rest of the day. After that, it was very tiring. And our outcome measures should reflect the flow of our daily lives and not be a snapshot at a clinic visit. So current measures for clinical trials are often measured at monthly intervals, and they're not necessarily capturing the day-to-day changes that happen in somebody's household. Next slide, please. All right, so why would digital health technologies matter to ALS families? Well, this may be a way to make research more inclusive. It's a way to make care a little bit better into our homes as well. Anything that we can do from home is a lot easier for those who are facing ALS, especially as the disease progresses. Things that may have been doable early on in the disease get continuously harder and harder. ALS has a median survival of about 30 months, and so people do progress very quickly in their disease. And so anything that we can do to overcome the mobility challenges and have our care and clinical assessments at home really helps very much. DHTs could reduce the travel and financial burden and the fatigue that comes with ALS and accessing trials and care. And this is really empowering to people who can more easily contribute meaningful data to ALS research. Next slide, please. All right, so earlier this year, I do have a social media platform. So we decided to conduct a survey. We did an IRB approved survey to kind of understand what community sentiments were about actigraphy. I really had, even though I've worked in the ALS space and I've worked for a company that ran a study that included actigraphy for ALS patients, it's hard to know without asking people what they think about this. And so we ran a survey of US adults who were diagnosed with ALS. We got 76 responses. 97% of people felt actigraphy would be valuable for tracking their progression. Every single person who answered the question about wearing devices said yes, they would wear a device, which I thought was pretty amazing. 80% were willing to wear 2 or more devices, and 76% were willing to wear devices all day. Some of the concerns, the comfort was the biggest concern, and a little less than 50% were concerned about comfort issues, but 35% had zero concerns at all about these devices. 64% of respondents felt it would reduce the travel burden. We also asked people whether or not they were familiar with actigraphy, because it is a technical term. And so we showed people within the survey what a device looks like. And even though people may not be familiar with actigraphy, most people are tracking health metrics in some way today, right? We're all familiar with phones that are tracking, steps, things like that, where there's a lot of smartwatches around tracking heart rate. And so there was a lot of familiarity with digital health technologies in general. So that was good. I think we had about 45% being naive to actigraphy devices entirely, and about half of the respondents were familiar with the devices through various studies they'd participated in. Over 90% believed actigraphy would track their walking, gait, and hand and arm movements, and 85% were interested in tracking sleep metrics. So really fascinating information that we collected through this survey. Rakesh, can you please advance the slide? All right, so what does this mean for the ALS community? People living with ALS are ready for digital measures. They're familiar with them. They're willing to wear them. Digital measures could reduce burden. It could increase access to care for us. It could increase access to research. It may improve data quality. Collaboration at this point between those facing the disease with researchers and regulators is truly essential to bring this into the clinic, or to bring this into our homes, and into clinical trials, and into our care settings. And digital health technologies may be capturing data that are more reflective of our daily lives, right? So we're getting those snapshot clinic visits right now, or those snapshot trial visits. And so this may be a way for us to really understand what's happening in the daily life of somebody. So I can say this, I know that in our household, the way that my husband was functioning in the morning might have been different from the evening, right? There were times where, oh my goodness, late in the disease where he suddenly regained function in one of his hands. And so those types of things are not captured by our current measures. And so this may be a way to really bring those measures to life for all of us. And I think that's the end of my presentation, Rakesh.
Thank you, Nadia. One second, let me start my video. Yeah. So thank you, Nadia. This was very, very good. And I'm going to briefly talk about uh, the findings and key takeaways on the ADDS ALS workshop we did in 2025, early 2025 at the ADDS conference in Pensacola. And as you can see in the picture, we had like people coming in from all of different backgrounds, diverse backgrounds, and what we discussed as the objective of the whole discussion was to how DHTs can help accelerate the clinical trials in ALS drug development. And I'm just going to present a couple of key aspects that what we learned from that discussion. I'm clicking next, it's loading. Okay, so as Nadia said, there's an urgent need for more sensitive, patient-centric, objective measures of disease progression, and also for tracking treatment effect. And not only these sensitive measures are going to help understand the trajectories and the training effect, but also in early stage trials, it can provide some early evidence on treatment effect, which can also encourage the investment for the further development of these drugs at early stage. So you can make that decision, go, no go, with this information. So as I said before, the objective was to look at these technologies. How can we integrate this? What are the current challenges? So what are the current gaps, and what can we do to make this across finishing line to get the regulatory approvals? So participants included, as I mentioned, patients with ALS, caregivers, academic researchers, industry researchers and scientists, DHT developers, clinical operation leads, so regulatory experts, and also representatives from patient advocacy groups. The agenda for this meeting or this workshop had like three themes. One was we discussed the current measurement tools and clinical trial use cases. Then we talked about the novel digital tools and industry adoption. What have we seen in the industry so far in general in terms of DHT use in clinical trials? And then the last discussion or the last theme was evidence generation and regulatory readiness. What do we need to do to get these measures or novel measures across the finishing line? And these discussions, these themes were done through presentations, whiteboard activities, roundtable discussions, and it was very, very engaging, very interactive. And the next couple of slides, I'm just going to summarize those findings. So first is what is the current measurement tool and or what are the current measurement tools and what is the wish list? What we ask this question, what do you want to see as a measure to everybody? What do you want to see? Because everyone right now that ALS FRS-R is being widely used in ALS as a primary endpoint. And we have always talked about this, and I'm not going to go through all the details of like where ALSFRS is not good, but it's what the current need is. And what we need right now is objective, low burden, sensitive. But one of the things we really need is basically can you track the progression? Okay, is the measure sensitive? Is it patient centric? That was one of the things that we wanted to. A lot of participants wanted to see in the measure. Reliable, strong measurement properties is something that we want. And it's not that we want to replace ALSFRS-R, but it's what can we use further to understand the disease and to understand the treatment. And DHTs are not like ready to use right now, or DHT is not like they are not having any challenges. There's clear like there's an unclarity of meaningfulness. So we always talk about clinicalness, meaningfulness, and then ALSFRS-R is still a ground truth. If you want to produce a measure that is a digitally derived, everyone still wants to correlate that with ALSFRS, and still it's used as a ground truth. And as the technology is evolving, there's a lot of measures out there now. Like, and so how do we navigate that? Like, how it's a proliferation of new measures. Which one do we pick? What do we do in terms of aggregating one particular measure or statistical properties of one measure to the other measure, what are the processing pipelines and so on. There's a lot of uncertainties also. So we did talk about that. But what we want at the end of the day is the sensitive measures is what we want. So one thing that we also discussed at length is what is the so if we are proposing a digital measure, the burden of proof is on us, right? So evidence generation requirements, what are these requirements? For sponsor buy-ins, for regulatory acceptance as a surrogate or intermediate clinical endpoint, for accelerated approval, or as a regulatory acceptance as a primary or secondary endpoint as a full approval. And for sponsors buy-in, one of the most important thing that everybody wanted is it has to have an improved sensitivity over ALSFRS. It should have strong measurement properties like low variability, high reliability, correlations with clinical scales for construct validity. Again, this was discussed a lot because we are again correlating with something like ALSFRS-R, which is again going back, why are we doing that? But there was also a discussion that maybe looking into structured patient inputs can also be used for understanding the meaningfulness of these measures. And also the ability to detect treatment was high priority. Obviously, we want to see the treatment effect. These are the some high priority items that we want to see in terms of evidence package, right? And then regulatory acceptance as an intermediate clinical endpoint or surrogate clinical endpoint through accelerated approval. It's feasible. It was discussed. It was considered feasible because of the unmet need that we have right now for the measurements. And for regulatory acceptance as a primary and secondary, it's going to be very heavy evidence generation requirement. And as you can see, all of these are part of that. The like moderately low and lower requirements or for the evidence needs are like the measures should have the precedence of success in other clinical studies, which is why so other sponsors will also have a buy-in. Prioritizing measures or a measure or two, because there's so many measures out there, we have to prioritize. This is something that has probably been going on even now. Like we have so many measures, but we need to prioritize these. And uh, encouragement for regulatory bodies is something that everyone, especially sponsors, they want to see that, and we have that, but they want to see that these measures are being encouraged, or these DHT measures are being encouraged by FDA, EMA, so which will also allow the sponsors to have take that step forward. And explicitly defined measures before the trial. We have to define these explicitly. We cannot have post hoc analysis and oh, this might work. We need to have a clear definition of these measures ahead of time. And prognostic value was like a low priority, but it's useful for accelerated approval. And it's relevant to the sensitivity and also construct validity part, where you can actually does the measure have the ability to predict the trajectory of the disease? So these were some of the things that we discussed, and what is gonna it's gonna take a lot of efforts. It's gonna take a lot of efforts from all the different bodies of the stakeholders. And these, if you summarize these into four categories, we have evidence and standards body, where you have researchers and regulators. We have drug development and clinical research, which is basically the trialists, the pharma, the biotech, the clinicians. We have DHT developers like Ametris or Modality AI, where we will manufacture the devices and software solutions for these. And then one of the most important is patient and advocacy community, patients, caregivers, advocacy groups. We need to understand what these measures mean. What is the clinical meaningfulness? What is the patient-centric measures? And that's the and you will see overlap with each and every one of these, and there is a lot of interaction and communication, and flow of information needs to happen. Uh, we just cannot work independently on this problem. We have to combine these forces and come up with. But this is something that was part of that, like a final take home, that this is what we need to do to take this ahead. And this was basically what we learned from this webinar. Hopefully this was helpful. So with that, I will now give it to Adam.
Thanks, Rakesh. Yeah, I think both you and Nadia really teed this up for me, so I appreciate that. So what I'd like to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about is how we can measure respiratory endpoints at home and how we're doing that at ZephyrX. So what I'll do is give you a really quick intro to ZephyrX. Rakesh and Nadia really already hit on the ALS challenges. So we'll dive into the solutions and show you some case studies on how sponsors are deploying remote respiratory monitoring at home. To give you a bit of context about ZephyrX, we were founded really to help reduce the burden for patients with chronic respiratory diseases back in 2019. Where we really found our footing was with COVID, when we partnered with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation to help monitor all of their CF patients across the country. And over the past 5 years, we've had a lot of rapid growth, where now we're an industry-leading cloud platform to deliver respiratory care, both into clinical trials and into clinical care at hospitals. So to date, we're in over 30 countries and have supported over 1.4 million pulmonary function tests. But what I want to focus on today, although we work on a lot of respiratory diseases, are the particular challenges in ALS. And specifically how we can measure lung function in ALS. So first of all, what is spirometry and why does it matter? Well, spirometry allows us to measure how much air a person can exhale, their vital capacity. And this is a direct window into the strength of their respiratory muscle. So it allows us to link these measures of ALSFRS-R to respiratory function changes. Now, across most respiratory diseases, spirometry is very much an FDA recognized, obviously quantitative and physiological endpoint that FDA uses and appreciates as primary or secondary endpoints. Of course, as we've already heard, there's a big burden to patients in ALS. And the challenge with spirometry is it's a difficult maneuver and usually is done in clinic. Another particular challenge with tracking lung function in ALS, as we heard from Nadia, is that there can be some rapid changes. So in this study by Geronimo and Simmons, what they found was that when they tracked lung function in the clinic in red, there was a substantial drop in forced vital capacity between the 3-month visits. And what that meant was for this study, they weren't able to get the patient on non-invasive ventilation as soon as they could have if they measured the patient remotely. So in blue, they also measured those patients remotely once a week with at-home spirometry. And they were able to show that they could get patients on non-invasive ventilation 2 months earlier by remote respiratory monitoring. So we're really thinking about those challenges around patient burden, doing this at home, and providing more continuous quantified endpoints. What we've developed is our decentralized suite of respiratory solutions. On the left here is ZephyrX Kiosk. What that is the in-clinic deployment of spirometry and other disease-specific endpoints. And what I'll focus on today is what's on the right, which is ZephyrX Home. So that's deploying spirometry onto a patient's mobile app from the comfort of their home. Now, the beauty of the platform here is it's all cloud-based. So we create a single source of truth in the center via data dashboards that providers and clinical trial sponsors can track their patients throughout the treatments. I'd like to tell you a bit about the ZephyrX Home patient experience. So what we do is we ship a Bluetooth-enabled spirometer to the patient's home. It comes equipped with a specific mouthpiece for ALS, for patients with bulbar weakness. And what is then done by the patient or the caregiver is they scan the QR code and they download the ZephyrX Breathe Easy app. This connects the app directly to the spirometer via Bluetooth, and they follow some simple on-screen instructions to get started. And to date, we've delivered over 50,000 of these to patients' homes. And when you have a spirometer connected to a mobile device at home, it then enables remote respiratory visits. So what we do is respiratory therapists specialized in ALS can use our web app to connect in person via a video call with their patients. And the respiratory therapist can then coach the patient through the spirometry maneuvers. In real time, the respiratory therapist is also seeing the flow volume loops come through, so they can do a real-time assessment on quality and ensure really high-quality spirometry efforts. Of course, we can do this in 2 different flavors, traditional forced spirometry, but I think what we're seeing is more and more important in ALS is the slow vital capacity maneuver, which is the least burdensome on patients. This can be done seated and supine, and the supine measurement is often used as another metric of muscle weakness when compared to the seated measurement. Also, with a smartphone and our app enabled at home, a patient can do self-administered spirometry. I'll show you some case studies on that in a minute, and can also complete daily symptom diaries, including even the ALSFRS-R if that wants to be done at home. What we've seen across respiratory disease is a really high compliance in using this app to complete their daily tasks. And because all the data is linked in the cloud, what that means is that the provider or the clinical trial sponsor can get real-time alerts depending on how they configure their environment. So we can immediately connect a patient to their provider if flow volume, if forced vital capacity, for instance, drops below a certain threshold. So I just want to spend a couple minutes on a few case studies. What we're seeing more and more is that sponsors are carving out sub-studies within their clinical trials in order to start to validate some of these at-home endpoints. Now, what's great about spirometry is it is a validated endpoint for in-clinic, but there's still a little bit of work to be done to get FDA comfortable with it being conducted at home remotely. So here's some data that was actually just presented a few weeks ago at the European Respiratory Society, where the sponsor performed both clinic coach spirometry on the x-axis and remote coach spirometry using the ZephyRx platform on the y-axis. And what they're showing is a really strong concordance between those measures done in clinic and those done at home, helping to validate that spirometry at home can be just as high quality. As you can see on the top, these are Bland-Altman plots that are looking at the difference in these spirometric measures between remote and clinic. And they essentially fall on at zero difference, right? So we're seeing no change in FVC and FEV1 values if they're measured at home or in clinic across 2 different days, day 1 and day 29. What's interesting is we're also seeing some work being done specifically in ALS. So we talked a lot about respiratory video visits, but this study here by Peller et al. Was looking at non-proctored visits. So this would be self-guided spirometry. What they're showing on the left here are 4 individual patients in which they're tracking their forced vital capacity over time. The blue circles are the proctored visits. Those are video visit calls where a respiratory therapist is on the other line. And the white open circles are the non-proctored calls where the patient, together with their caregiver, is performing these spirometry maneuvers on their own. And what this group has shown is a really, really strong correlation between the data quality for proctored and non-proctored spirometry measurements, hopefully paving the way for more at-home self-administered endpoints in ALS. So I'll just end by, looking forward a bit. I spent most of the time talking about forced vital capacity and slow vital capacity, but when you have a patient comfortable with using a mobile device at home, this really unlocks a bunch of those exploratory endpoints, including measuring muscle strength directly with MIP, cough, and other endpoints. And I think we can think together as a community on how these endpoints can be put together into composite metrics that can really track with ALS, like we've been talking about. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for your time. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Well, thank you, Adam. I suppose I'm going to be next. And if you could advance the slides on my behalf, that would be fantastic. And thank you, Nadia and Rakesh and Adam for setting the stage. We are Modality. We also create self-guided at-home assessments that are active rather than passive with the ActiGraph. But we are specifically focusing on speech, communication, and fine motor movements. If you would go to the next slide, please, which shows a few of the points that were made already, specifically around the fact that the assessment of disease progression is so essential. And today, one of the root causes of failing trials in ALS is, among other things, that the assessments are based on ALSFRS-R very often and are not very sensitive or responsive. And you go to the next slide, you will see how such an assessment actually happens in the clinic usually, as pointed out. So when you look at the communication between a physician and a patient, for example, when an ALSFRS-R assessment is being done, it is often, based on a conversation between the two, and behaviors and responses of the patient are being taken into consideration to fill out the typical survey. We are inspired by what happens at the clinic. We are inspired by the conversation between the physician and the patient, and created the virtual guide Tina, who is interviewing patients, usually in the convenience of their homes, and in doing so, walking them through a very structured interview, thereby capturing not only what patients say, but also what they do, their speech responses, their facial movements, body movements, even cognitive aspects. Tina also asks patients to describe their most bothersome problems in their own words. So she looks at how patients function, their communication and fine motor movements, but also how they feel, describing their current symptoms and problems in their own words. When you go to the next slide, you will see how that actually works in real life. It is, as I mentioned, a self-administered form. It does not require you, however, to install any software or use any special device. Patients usually use their own devices that they are comfortably using at home. It can be their laptop, their smartphone, their iPad, anything that's web connected is compatible with Modality and with Tina. And the only thing that really happens is that the research site actually sends an email to the patient. They click on a personalized link, and the next thing that happens is that Tina pops up in the web browser of their own device, and they have a conversation of about 5 to 10 minutes. And through this structured interview, we are capturing these outcome measures that describe communication, speech, and movement in various forms. When you go to the next slide, you will see what the operational advantages is of this. Of course, we have seen the advantages of using actigraphy, of using respiratory measurements like SFRX. Here we focus on different domains, but the advantage, as I mentioned, are, among other things, that there is no special hardware or software required, works on all these devices, no passwords or anything to remember for people. It's a self-administered form. So we heard from Adam that, for example, some of the assessments may still be proctored in their case. In our case, it is not usually the case. We fully rely on self-administration guided by Tina, the virtual guide. And it is also something that actually continues on, specifically in ALS. As you know, disease progresses fast. These assessments are done until people can no longer produce a sound. And that is relatively late in the disease progression. The data is also immediately available, like in Adam's case, so that sites and research administrators can see the quality of the data and the completeness of these assessments. When you go to the next slide, you will see how we work with sponsors of clinical trials. So we are exclusively used in clinical research today. Ametris, of course, an important partner of ours. So are the Department of Veterans Affairs and the NIH and many of the foundational research institutions, of course, like MGH, Target ALS, and other non-for-profit organizations. But of course, our customers include many biotech companies and pharma companies that you can see here some examples of. When you go to the next slide, you will see that ALS is one of the two major focus areas that we have. We have been conducting over a dozen studies in ALS, many observational studies and interventional trials as well, with a total of almost 30 publications now. Modality is a very research-heavy organization. We collaborate with many academic institutions and pharmaceutical companies as well, including in publications. We have collected over 2 million recordings, speech and video recordings over the past years, and worked with over 80,000, almost 80,000 participants across many countries and international research sites. When you go to the next slide, you will see how a typical ALS protocol actually looks like. Going to ALS a little bit more in detail, as I mentioned, an assessment usually takes less than 10 minutes. And it measures things like sustained phonation, DDK task. It also contains things like a picture description to elicit spontaneous speech. There is the patient report of problems, where Tina asks patients to describe their most bothersome problems in their own words. So we're capturing speech responses, language, and also facial movements, body movements. We have an activity of daily living task as well that we've developed that is also part of that protocol. Here are a few of the typical measures, as you know, and it was mentioned also by Rakesh before, you want to pre-specify these measures. So we usually have something like 4 different measures that we pre-specify. Other ones are available as well for later analysis. This one here is what we call canonical timing alignment, which is a very strong measure of intelligibility, which is a key factor in disease progression in ALS. 2 of the things that were also mentioned before from the workshop that Rakesh described are that these measures should be sensitive and responsive. Sensitive in the sense that they're able to detect small changes relatively early so that decisions can be made or it can be understood how the treatments, for example, affect the disease. Responsive because you want to understand whether these measures actually provide information about the disease progression, which is so essential in neurodegenerative diseases like ALS. You may also wonder whether, for example, these measures that I described can be used in barber versus non-barber onset. And the answer is yes. You see an example here where the non-barber onset is actually the red line, the barber onset is the blue line, both of which are significantly progressing over time, which also provides important information for interventional trials that have both of these populations included. So, for example, here you can see that within somewhere between 4 and 9 weeks, it is expected, even in smaller studies, to be able to show disease progression. And depending on the treatment effect, of course, it is expected to see a treatment response. When you go to the next slide, you will see that's one of our key journal papers which I would invite you to read, which contains a few of the major takeaways. First of all, the fact that these measures can be reliably extracted, they are robust, they are clinically and analytically validated. The specific measures that showed disease progression in ALS are outlined there, among other things, the canonical time alignment that I mentioned. Also, the fact that with relatively small studies, and you, for example, conduct a phase 1b study that contains only 30 patients, that you are expected to have already relatively robust and reliable measurements. And then, of course, that these measurements can track disease progression much more sensitively than the ALSFRS-R. And when you go to the next slide, I think that's wrapping it up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dia. So let me start. Okay. So I just forgot to mention this. Please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will try our best to answer your questions. And now, Colin, if you could come online, and then we can start discussing this further. And I actually want to start with the high level question, something that I always wanted to get information from everybody that I talk to is what is the biggest unmet need in ALS drug development right now that DHTs can realistically help with? And it's something that it's like everybody wants to know. Everyone, I was just at Neil's conference, and I hardly found any discussion going on about DHTs at that conference. And it was pretty sad to me personally, but it is something that we want to know, like why people are not, but that's probably like a part B question, but I just want to know what are the unmet needs that we can actually address with these technologies. Colin, if you can start.
Um, I I think that really the big part of this, and some of the comments that Nadia mentioned earlier, really echo in some of our early landscaping around like unmet needs in ALS. One of the clear things that was very apparent to persons living with ALS was their need to be involved in their care and wanting to track symptoms of their disease and progression in a remote manner. One for empowerment, but also just access, right? I mean, traveling across the lifespan of disease, having that remote technology to give feedback versus traveling and hoofing, to a clinic was really important to them. But also just as equally the empowerment of being able to understand and be a participant in their assessments and whatnot. And so, I think DHTs really fulfill this. And I think, most of the presentations today really focused on symptomatic disease. And I think that one of the things that DHTs do offer is with genetic carriers and others, really a lifespan approach of assessments and monitoring that can be done in a more of a feasible, deployable mechanism. And so, I would say that that's one of the things that obviously really excites me about the technology and the capabilities and impact that they might have.
Okay. Thank you, Colin. Nadia, do you want to give it a crack?
Yeah, I have trouble understanding why we aren't using more DHTs in ALS, right? Because it just makes sense. Just like when we were going through ALS in 2019 and 2020, there weren't virtual support groups available to us at the beginning. And then suddenly during COVID, there was all these virtual support groups and there was all these informational webinars that started popping up. And those things have stuck around, well, for all of us outside of ALS too, but especially in ALS because people can't leave their homes easily, right? And so, DHTs, we have the ability to measure the actual losses. I mean, to me, this is not unlike a tumor shrinking in cancer, right? Movement is the thing we're losing. The voice and the breathing are the things that we're losing. So why aren't we using objective, continuous ways to measure these things? I don't know. To me, it's a very confusing thing.
Adam?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways it comes down to a sponsor who wants to step up and lead the charge there. I mean, I come to this from a slightly different angle, looking across all respiratory diseases. And what we've seen in a very different group, asthma and COPD, is that a major global sponsor will step up and start carving out DHTs into their protocols and then taking that data to the regulators. So we really need a sponsor to really step up and lead the charge there. And we can come and support that with evidence and help build that data case for them.
Thank you, Adam. DSO, anything to add? You're muted.
Thank you very much. In my opinion, I mentioned it briefly when I said, many of the trials fail today, over 90%, 95% of trials fail. And it is often questionable, whether this is because the drug wasn't working or whether the assessments weren't working at that time. So in my opinion, DHTs, specifically in clinical research, can meet this unmet need, which is to really respond to these questions, whether the therapy is making a difference and what sort of change it makes. And that is actually something that for pharmaceutical sponsors is a very economic question. The return on investment, which was mentioned before, can be quite significant if we are able to make a difference here and potentially then for the patient bring treatments to the market that otherwise would just land on the shelf.
Thank you. Yeah, Colin, go on, please.
I just want to add to DSO's comment. I think that's been a huge, thing that's limited the potential. I think the ADS discussions really centered around this. And, I think that's one of the things that I know our organization has been focusing on is trying to begin to understand sort of the how DHTs can be best used in ALS clinical studies as either COAs of digital direct biomarkers. And so, obviously we've been very fortunate to receive ActiGraph data from one of the nonprofits and then some of the universities that are out there. But we're continuing to try to address this because I think in order to inform, aspects in drug development, really understanding how the concepts of interest relate to clinical meaningfulness and then the clinical validity steps and things really are really regimented and things within the contents of regulatory strategies so that sponsors can best use them in the support of evidence or primary evidence in approval of therapeutics, obviously. And that would dovetail some of the conversations around, the patient-focused drug development and the essential pieces of disease progression and lifespan of disease that would really be important to maximize the potential use of these in treatment development.
And by the way, I just wanted to add to something that Rakesh said, because you went to the Niels conference just last week, and you said, look, not too many conversations about digital and artificial intelligence, but I would say quite the opposite is the case, because I've been going to ALS conferences for a long time, and so the change is coming. It is really, we are approaching an inflection point. Every single of these sponsors I was talking to are starting to have an AI strategy, are starting to look at DHTs, are starting to be curious, trying to identify, what can they do, which one, how is it going to be implemented, what are the regulatory questions. So there's a lot of interest. It's just that it's not quite mainstream. We're nowhere close to mainstream. We are still scratching the surface, but yes, it is coming. I'm clearly seeing it.
Thank you, dear. So we have a couple of questions in the audience. So I'm going to start with one which is really good. The power of the ALSFRS-R is that it covers different aspects of function that are meaningful to the patients. How do we construct a composite score from DHTs that cover different functional domains? It's a very good question. I don't think we can but I'll let the panelists speak, and then we can probably summarize it. It's a very good question. So, Colin, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you first start with, measuring the concepts of interest that are important and that are represented in the ALSFRS. And I think that this panelists have covered many of those in the discussion. And that would be sort of your first start. And then understanding how the meaningfulness characteristics would change and whatnot would be sort of part two. I won't go into a lot of detail just for sake of time, but I mean, I think we're already in the initial process of putting the building blocks together. It's really understanding the gaps in interpretability when it comes to regulatory endorsement will be important. And I think each of the instruments that are being used, have different questions. And so you'd start out with, checking your boxes in each of the gap analysis and pursuing those in a logistical way. That sounds really complicated. I don't think it's an arduous task. It just requires, more of, people sharing data and beginning to have open discussions about, how to fulfill the gaps in determining that. And so I'll pause there for some of the other panelists to add in and add to the discussion.
DSO, you want to go?
Definitely. I think the question has two parts. First is, how can we cover the different different domains that the ALSFRS-R covers, and I think the representations here on this panel are fantastic because many of the domains are being addressed this way. So I'm feeling relatively comfortable, and we have been in studies together, right? It's often that sponsors say, okay, we want to measure movement, we want to measure respiration, we want to measure speech. So let's put these together in the trial to get a really comprehensive view on what is going on with my patient. That makes a lot of sense. The other thing, of course, is the composite score that was asked. And that's a more complicated thing because it would require us to take our outputs and put them together, lump them together into one score. And that is a very, very complicated endeavor to be done because it depends on all sorts of things, on the population, on the specific corpus, on the specific use case. And I'm not really sure whether this is an end goal. That we will take all our technologies, put them all together into one score. I see it more that individual measures that are clinically interpretable, that are clear, easy to understand and to communicate, will probably be the result. That we have something like maybe 3-4 measures, one about respiration, one about movement, one about communication, that they will live side by side.
Thank you, dear. So I think we have a few minutes left. There are a few questions. I just want to add that, yes, the appeal of ALSFRS, I understand that, but Rubin's publications in the past, you can have two patients with completely different symptoms, but have the same ALSFRS score only because you're aggregating all these at the same time, right? So the aggregation and getting into that one number does not really entirely represent the patient, and two people can have same score but are entirely different pathway to on their or different trajectory of the disease. So thank you. There's another question I want to take. For the patient report of problems, how are their responses codified and interpreted. Does TINA, the algorithm, track only descriptions of physical symptoms, or does it do a mental health assessment as well? TSO, that's for you.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So what Tina does or asks is actually, can you describe in your own words the most bothersome problem or problems with your ALS? And so you can then start talking in your own words as long as you want about the things that you experience. So it is not limited to any specific domain, any specific types of symptoms. It can be anything. It can be sleep. It can be mental. It can be movement. It can be respiration. Anything you're experiencing. And so what then happens is you speak about these things. They are being recognized and transcribed automatically. And then they go through a large language model classifier where we extract up to 66 different symptoms that are manually curated. So 66 different symptoms can be distinguished in their priority levels. And you do this usually every maybe 3 months. So you do it before, for example, an interventional trial, and then in the middle of an interventional trial at the end to see whether the symptom categories do change.
Thank you. Thank you. We have like 4 minutes left. I'm going to do my best to get these. Are companies hesitant to include this in their trials if they are phase 2 or phase 3 and previous trials used ALSFRS? Uh, so if you have previously used ALSFRS and are companies willing to do DHTs now, moving on phase 2 to phase 3? Adam, maybe you can start.
So we've seen yes, but it comes back to dollars and cents, right? So the reason why sponsors are now putting in these more exploratory DHTs is to find a way to eventually differentiate their assets, their pharma assets from competitors, right? So perhaps it's not going to be an endpoint that makes it through the regulators and they'll lead with the standard endpoint, but they're taking a longer term view because they know competition's coming and they're going to want a way to differentiate. And that's why they're looking, just like you said, Rakesh, for the sensitive endpoints that can really dictate and show how the drug is responding.
Yeah, maybe adding to this, of course, ALSFRS-R is going to be there, so we're not replacing it. That's not anything we claim. So it's going to be the primary endpoint for the time being. Yes, the sponsors are putting it into phase 2 studies and phase 3 studies. The HEDI platform that has certain DHT measures, for example, in Europe, the same situation. Phase 3 studies, like for example, the upcoming Prelenia predopidine study will have digital endpoints. So they're being put into later stage, even pivotal trials. And the FDA has provided feedback that certain digital measures are going to be considered for regulatory decision making. Not that they are qualified endpoints, not that, if, say, a speech change has been shown of XYZ, then yes, the drug is going to be approved. That's not the situation. But the situation is that together with the results of the ALSFRS-R and NFL, these digital endpoints will also be considered so that a decision can be made. And specifically in ALS, of course, there's more wiggle room, there's more openness than in other diseases by the FDA.
Thank you. There's one comment, Nadia. The community needs to know that patients are ready for these technologies, and probably the survey information should be definitely published, which I think you are working on right now. So I just want to just read it out loud so that everyone understands, because this is a good comment. So Nadia, if you want to just add quickly to that.
Yeah, yes, we did have a poster at Neil's. I have a poster at the M&D Symposium, and yes, that we need community involvement in all of this, especially as we're trying to determine what is clinically meaningful to patients. Right, patients need to be brought into this conversation. There should be a lot more public conversations. I am planning to help with that as much as I can, and I'm grateful for this forum. For sure. But yeah, I don't know why we haven't had those conversations yet, but it's definitely time.
I am so sorry. There are like 3 or 4 left, and I don't think we can get through them. We are like 1 o'clock. I just want to have like one last comment. Like, if we were to reconvene in 5 years from now on, what would the success look like for DHTs? I don't want to reconvene in 5 years. I would love to do that in like every year or every 6 months. But let's just say, how would it look in like few years if we say that, oh, this is now a successful modality for us to do the clinical trials? Maybe Colin, you can quickly.
I would say that they just become commonplace in how we include them in clinical trials, either as primary or secondary endpoints. I also would suggest that independent of clinical trials, something that could more easily track, home use for medical care, which is a totally different sort of regulatory pathway and indication. But I do think that, the conversations are the right ones that we're having now, and working towards at least the former one, and I crossing the finish line with the different modalities would be a win for me.
Thank you. Thank you. DSO, maybe just go.
Yeah, my personal goal is within this time frame, definitely drug approval that was based partially at least on a DHT.
Great. Adam, if you can just go to the next slide. I just want to thank everyone who joined. I'm really sorry for not taking all the questions, but we will make sure to get back on these via email. If this is another relevant, if you see the barcode on the screen, please click on that. That's Dr. Shu from one of our long-term collaborators in Australia, University of Queensland, and Christine Guo, our CSO, discussing how DHTs can actually enable robust research data. So, and then next month we have ADDS 2025 Reflections webinar, basically learnings from Basel, and also Basel conference that we recently concluded, and a preview of 2026 meeting too. So again, thank you all the panelists for their valuable time. This was a very good discussion, and again, thank you for everyone who joined it. And with this, we will get back to the questions that were not answered, but thank you again for everyone. And with this, we'll conclude this webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for organizing it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Rakesh.
Thank you.